They say the ocean doesn't forget, that it stores everything, bones, wrecks, whispers, truths too heavy to surface. I never used to believe in that kind of talk. I was a sonar technician, not a mystic. My world was waveforms, algorithms, pulses bouncing off submerged walls. I spent most of my adult life mapping silence. The sea was just data to me. That is, until the sound came. Until I heard something that didn't make sense. Until I heard something that answered back. It started as a routine deployment aboard the Davenport, an aging Navy research submarine refitted for deepwater acoustic testing. Nothing glamorous, no weapon systems, no spy missions. Just a dozen crewmen and 2 civilian scientists stuffed into a pressurized steel tube, descending into the darkness like an iron seed dropped into rich soil. Our mission was simple: test the new multi-frequency sonar array at variable depths along the North Atlantic fault line. We'd done it a dozen times before. No one expected anything unusual. Certainly not me. We had reached 700 meters when I picked it up. I was reviewing the initial test pings, scanning for interference or misalignment. Most of it was background noise, the usual clicks from passing squid, the distant rumble of seafloor tectonics. But then, in the far right channel, something strange appeared. A pattern. Faint, but unmistakably structured. It wasn't noise. It wasn't an echo from our own signal either. It was something else. A 5-pulse sequence spaced at uneven intervals, like someone knocking on a door they didn't know was there. I isolated the sequence and ran it again. Then again. Same result. Each time, the pulses returned slightly altered, as if they were adapting to my inputs. That made no sense. Sound doesn't learn. Sound doesn't change. I logged the anomaly, flagged it for the chief, and ran a diagnostic on the array. Standard procedure. Maybe a calibration fault, I thought. A glitch. The sea is full of strange acoustics, thermal layers, salinity distortions. But the feeling stayed with me. The feeling that I had just heard something that wasn't supposed to be heard. The chief dismissed it. Ghost reflections, he said, without looking up from his terminal. Heat shift. But the civilian scientist, Dr. Yasmin Rai, wasn't so quick to brush it off. She asked to hear the clip. I played it for her twice, then a third time. She didn't say a word, just stared at the waveform like it had teeth. Later that evening, she requested a detour, 15 nautical miles east, near a depth anomaly she'd marked on her charts. There's something down there, she said. Something that doesn't belong. The captain wasn't pleased. Rerouting meant burning extra fuel, extending the mission timeline, and pushing our old submarine deeper than it was technically rated for. But the order came down anyway, from command no less. We received a coded transmission authorizing full cooperation with Dr. Ray's request. That was odd. We weren't even supposed to be in active comms range. Someone had been tracking us. Someone knew we'd heard something, and they wanted us to hear more. We arrived at the coordinates just after Oro 200 hours. The sea was calm above, but below, the pressure felt different. Not heavier exactly, more like denser, thicker. Like the water itself was resisting our presence. The air on board grew stale. Condensation gathered along the pipes. No one spoke much after midnight. It was as if the silence was louder than usual, pulsing with some kind of internal rhythm. And when I activated the sonar again, I knew instantly we were not alone. This time, the response came before I even triggered the ping. A low, humming vibration swept through the speakers, unbidden. Then, the same 5 pulses, but stronger, clearer, deeper. They came from below, at a depth we hadn't reached. A depth we shouldn't reach. The acoustic profile was unlike anything I'd seen. Organic, but metallic. Rhythmic, but chaotic. Like a language being formed in real time. I looked at Dr. Rai. Her face had gone pale. She simply whispered, "It's calling. Calling." That word stuck with me. Not transmitting. Not echoing. Calling. Something with intent. Something with awareness. I recorded the signature, filed another report, and we continued deeper. I should have objected. I should have said something. But part of me wanted to know. Wanted to see what lived at the bottom of that call. Hours passed. At 1,100 meters, we reached a plateau, an underwater shelf that dropped into an abyss too deep to chart with our instruments. No light reached it. No life stirred. The sonar returned only silence, until it didn't. Suddenly, our array lit up with interference, like a scream too deep to hear with human ears. The monitors flashed, the readings jittered. Something massive had moved below us. Not drifted. Moved, deliberately. And in that moment I understood what fear really was. Not panic, not adrenaline, but cold, paralyzing awe. We dropped a probe. It vanished after 5 seconds. No signal, no impact. Just static. The hull of the Davenport began to creak, groaning like it was being remembered by something older than metal. The lights flickered, and then came the last ping, short, slow, and unmistakably ours. The system had sent a pulse, but we hadn't triggered it. We weren't the ones listening anymore. We were the ones being watched. I saved the data logs under a new file. I encrypted it. I even renamed the folder something meaningless, Echo 0A9. But I knew what it was. It wasn't an echo. It was an answer. And it had been waiting a long, long time to be heard. They say the ocean doesn't forget. Now I believe them. Because something out there heard us once. And I have a feeling it's still listening. In the hours following the last ping, the Davenport felt heavier. Not in the physical sense, our ballast systems hadn't changed, but in the kind of way that presses on your chest when you're being watched, when you've just read something you weren't supposed to read or opened a door you should have walked past. That feeling clung to every surface, like condensation made of fear. I sat alone in the sonar room, replaying the response over and over. I told myself I was analyzing it, studying the waveform, measuring its frequency deviation. But the truth was simpler. I was listening for anything human in it. I wanted to believe that somewhere in that deep, distorted resonance, there was a pattern. Something explainable. Something I could chart and walk away from. But it didn't come. All I heard was attention, and the unsettling realization that the signal hadn't just responded, it had originated. Before we even pinged, it was already rising. Like it had heard us coming. The official report I filed was flagged and sent to Naval Intelligence before I even hit submit. That was my first real warning sign. Normally, these anomalies would get passed up to the Regional Analysis Unit and eventually disappear into some academic archive of curiosities. This one was rerouted in seconds. Seconds. Not only that, within 15 minutes, we received a new course directive from HQ. And it wasn't a suggestion, it was a full override. I watched the captain read the incoming message in silence. His fingers drummed against the console for a few moments before he stood up and requested everyone meet in the comms room. When we gathered, he kept the briefing short. We've been given new coordinates. This mission is now under classified directive. All data logs, voice memos, sonar signatures, and footage are restricted to onboard access only. That means no backups, no cloud sync, no transmissions without direct authorization. No one asked why. That's the thing about military protocols. You don't need belief, only obedience. But I saw it in their faces. They knew something was wrong. And for the first time since I joined the service, I saw the captain look uncertain. We changed course. Our heading shifted 40 degrees southeast, toward a stretch of ocean known for little more than undersea mountains and tectonic folds. The new coordinates weren't even on our standard charts. We had to manually input them into the guidance system using a patch cable sent along with the encrypted directive. The patch unlocked an entirely separate set of bathymetric data, an unofficial gridline map labeled only as NM Black. There are places in the ocean that don't exist on paper, or at least not on our paper. Some are sites of wreckage, some are old nuclear test zones. Others are marked as biologically sensitive areas, which is code for don't ask, don't go. This place? It was deeper, stranger. There were no notations, just a blank cell over a pit, an unnatural trench, shaped more like a tear than a valley, a wound. We arrived at grid 0-7 Delta around 0330 hours. The surface above was placid, almost eerily still. The water had a kind of thick gloss to it, like it resisted breaking apart. I've seen dead calm before, but this was different. Even the seagulls had vanished. Our descent began immediately. At 400 meters, the water darkened more rapidly than it should have. At 800, our navigation lights began to lose clarity. At 1000, the pressure gauges started flickering. We weren't anywhere near crush depth, but the systems behaved like we were. Dr. Rayai sat across from me in the control room, silent as ever. I asked her if she had any idea what was at the new site. She didn't answer at first. Then, As if parsing through thoughts she didn't want to share, she said, "I've seen fragments in old seismic data. Things that don't match any known geological formation. Cavities that appear and vanish. Faults that pulse, like breathing." I asked her why we were really here. She replied, "Because we finally made a sound loud enough for it to hear us." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the sonar, ears peeled for any modulation, any harmonic shift. The hum had returned. Faint, steady, like a bass line to something building. And then it began again. The same 5-pulse sequence, but slower this time, like it was thinking. And this time, the pulses were followed by a trailing frequency, one that vibrated within the metal of the sub itself. The Davenport groaned in response, as if tuning to it. We recorded everything, but it was pointless. When I reviewed the files the next morning, all audio data had been scrubbed, replaced by blank static. Not overwritten, emptied. The waveforms were there, but they were hollow. No sound, no signal. Just a perfect visual of silence. I checked the system integrity. Nothing had been compromised. Nothing hacked. The sound had simply unexisted itself. By dawn, the crew was on edge. Something about the air felt heavy. Not from carbon buildup or mechanical fault. Psychologically heavy. We started having trouble with internal comms. Headsets chirped randomly. Intercoms echoed phrases no one remembered saying. At one point, a technician claimed to hear a voice repeating his name from the ballast chamber. He refused to go back down there. He wasn't the only one. The temperature regulation began fluctuating next. One moment, the cabin was ice cold. The next, stifling. Lights flickered. Shadows elongated strangely, as if the geometry of the vessel was being warped ever so slightly. But the captain ordered us to continue. And we did. Straight toward the trench. At 1,400 meters, we entered its upper rim. The seafloor dropped away like a curtain yanked into oblivion. The sonar stopped returning useful topography. It simply pulsed outward into open black. Dr. Ray said nothing, but she leaned in closer to the monitors, watching the void as if waiting for something to rise from it. And then, the sonar pinged without prompt. Once. Twice. 5 times. We hadn't triggered anything. No one had. I checked the logs. No automated cycle had been initiated. The system had activated on its own. Each pulse returned a delay. Not a bounce, not an echo. A delay. As if whatever was receiving them was considering how to answer. And then came a 6th sound. Low. Drawn out. Scraping. Not from the speakers. From the hull. Something had touched the Davenport. The captain immediately ordered all hands to stations. We stopped our descent, hovering at 1,500 meters above the trench. But no matter what we did, ballast adjustment, reverse thrusters, directional realignment, we were still drifting downward. Slowly. Inexorably. Like something had taken hold and was pulling us in. That's when Dr. Ray pulled out a small black drive from her coat. "If we lose contact," she said, "this is all that matters." She handed it to me. It had no label, no encryption, just a note etched on its surface. "Do not transmit. Ever." I asked what was on it. She said, "Proof. But not the kind they want to find." The lights dimmed, the pressure increased, and outside, beneath us, something stirred. No one knew when the descent truly resumed. It wasn't announced. There was no engine hum, no thruster kick, no mechanical shift. One moment we were stabilizing at 1,500 meters, fingers dancing nervously over blinking consoles and flickering pressure gauges. And the next, we were falling. Silently, imperceptibly. As if gravity had rewritten itself in slow motion, ignoring our machines entirely. The depth meter climbed by single digits at first, 1503, 1507, 1512, but by the time we noticed, we were past 1600. The autopilot controls remained locked, manual override failed. Thrusters were non-responsive. Even the ballast tank showed neutral. Technically, we should have been suspended, but we weren't. We were sinking. And something wanted us to. Captain Furlan's voice echoed over the intercom, steadier than I imagined he'd be. "This vessel is no longer under standard navigation. All non-critical personnel are to remain in quarters until further notice. Engineering, stand by for manual ballast access." Dr. Ray didn't move. She stood near the viewport, a narrow slit of reinforced glass designed only for orientation, not exploration. She stared outward into a darkness that refused to settle. as if something massive shifted in the periphery just outside our comprehension. "It's not water," she murmured. "At this depth, it should be pitch black. But this isn't absence. This is something in the dark." I asked her again what she thought was down here. I didn't expect an answer. But this time she turned to me, her expression no longer guarded but hollow, as if the thing she feared had already spoken its name somewhere inside her. "I saw an echo in 2012, she said, "on a seismic report from a French deep ocean probe that never made it back. A harmonic inversion, like an acoustic mirror, something that bounces back frequencies not as reflections but as translations. What we heard wasn't just a reply, it was a word." "What word?" She didn't answer. At 1,700 meters, the hull began to vibrate, not from pressure strain or tectonic movement, but rhythmically, like it was being sung to. The lights dimmed again, not entirely, just enough to cast long, low shadows that refused to match the angles of their sources. The hum returned, louder this time, bleeding through the walls and into our heads, not through our ears, through our bones. It crawled through marrow and spine like an infection. People began reporting nausea, migraines, loss of direction. One technician vomited blood without warning, collapsed, and had to be sedated. Our med officer found nothing in his system. No toxin, no pressure trauma, just internal confusion, like his organs had shifted orientation for no reason. The hum didn't let up. I retreated back to sonar. If there was anything I could make sense of, it was signal, patterns, anything. But when I pulled up the waveform history, I froze. It wasn't random. The 5-pulse structure had changed. It was now 6 pulses, repeated every 40 seconds, and buried in the trailing signal was a low, clipped frequency modulating in what resembled Morse. But not our alphabet. Not human. Not Earth-based. The rhythm was too perfect, too consistent. No biological source could do this, and no machine could have survived down here long enough to generate it. But there it was, repeating. And with every pulse, the depth increased. 1800, 1801, 1802. The descent was accelerating. Captain Furlan entered sonar without knocking, which he never did. He'd always respected roles, boundaries. But this time, his posture was different. Tighter, eyes bloodshot. "What are we hearing?" he asked. I told him I didn't know. I told him it wasn't natural. That the signal had changed and whatever was below us, it wanted us here. He didn't reply. Instead, he showed me a file. Classified. Red tape sealed. Tagged with ascent and deep vein. He shouldn't have had it. Hell, I shouldn't have seen it. But he showed me anyway. Inside, a satellite scan from 2007 of the same trench we were hovering over. Back then, the pit had been 2,100 meters deep. Now it measured well over 3,000. The shape had changed too. It wasn't just widening. It was reaching. Tendrils of topography forming concentric folds like the iris of an eye. And buried at the center, barely visible through terrain shading, was a smooth ring. Perfectly circular. Metallic. 50 meters across. Heatless. Motionless. But in the final thermal image in the file, it began to glow. That was 2 years ago. I asked him why we weren't warned. He laughed, short and bitter. Because whatever they thought they buried, they didn't. At 2,100 meters, the alarms started. Not system alarms. Emergency tone override. Red band klaxons meant for hull breaches or reactor leaks. But all systems read nominal. No integrity loss. No radiation. No heat differential. Just noise. And then silence. Total. The kind that makes your ears ache with the void. We'd entered a pressure pocket. Impossible. There are no pressure pockets this deep. Water doesn't behave like that. But our instruments began to flatten. Depth, current, salinity. Everything stabilized at impossible values. As if the laws of physics had taken a breath. The pressure dropped by half. Dr. Rai panicked. That was the moment I knew we were beyond science. She started scanning the wavefront manually, ignoring the computer processors. Her hands trembled. "It's opening," she whispered. "It's inviting us." And then the light came. Not bright, not artificial. Organic. Pale blue, then violet, then black again. A slow pulse rising from below. Not beamed, bled. It seeped upward through the water in slow pulses. Like bioluminescent blood. And for the first time since we'd arrived, the sonar returned something solid. It was rising to meet us. We scrambled to regain control, but the helm was locked. Guidance unresponsive. Engine control disabled. Even the analog ballast release jammed. Captain Furlan gave the order to reverse ascent via emergency propulsion. The system accepted the command, and nothing happened. Then the Davenport lurched. Not forward, sideways. The ocean shouldn't allow that. But we felt it. A shift. A reorientation of gravity within the sub. I fell against the wall. Others were thrown from their chairs. Rai hit her head and bled across the console. Somewhere down the corridor, I heard metal twist. Someone screamed. I crawled back to the viewport. And there it was. Not a structure, not a vessel, not a creature. A shape. Too big to comprehend. Curved, like the rim of a bowl the size of a mountain, but smoother than any alloy we'd ever engineered. And it wasn't moving toward us. We were being pulled into it. We were descending not through the ocean, but through something older. Something that had been waiting. And it had finally opened its eyes. There is a point in descent where the body stops registering depth. Past a certain mark, everything becomes weightless in meaning. Darkness is no longer absence, but saturation. Orientation dissolves. You're no longer falling. You're simply being surrendered. And that's what it felt like as the Davenport drifted toward that impossible rim. Like a mouth opening to receive us. Not hungrily, but patiently. As if the interval between discovery and consumption was always meant to be this long. We stabilized. Or rather, we thought we had. The instruments began to lie in sync. Depth, constant. Pressure, ideal. Oxygen, perfect. But every crew member could feel it. We weren't where we were supposed to be, and the sub knew it. The air was too still. The hum too distant now, like it had retreated into the walls. It left behind something worse than sound. Impressions. I started seeing movement in places where no movement should be. Shadows that weren't cast. Lights that weren't emitted. And worst of all, reflections in glass where no one was standing. We locked the main cabin. Standard procedure. Emergency lights on. Manual override engaged. Engineering rerouted power through auxiliary systems to get some kind of feed running again. Cameras had gone offline during the tilt. The outer viewports were now covered in a milky residue, as if the water itself had thickened into a glaze that rejected light. Visibility. 0. Then the cameras flickered back on. One by one. 9 exterior hull cams, grainy, colorless, but functional. We gathered around the central feed screen, expecting nothing but static and sediment. What we saw instead froze the entire room. Geometry. That's the only word I have for it. Not architecture. Not wreckage. Not reef or ruin. Geometry. As if space itself had been bent, not shattered, not broken, but folded in deliberate ways. Patterns that no current existed to carve. Hexagonal trenches, spiraling walls of matte black ridges. Impossible smoothness at unnatural angles. Every corner we turned showed new iterations of the same motif. Balance disrupted intelligently. It's a structure, someone whispered behind me. This is a building. But it wasn't. Not in any human sense. Buildings are made to hold things. To contain. What we saw wasn't meant to hold. It was meant to trap. Each angle suggested imprisonment. Each corridor a channel. Like a net for thoughts, not bodies. Camera 5 flickered harder than the others, then stabilized. Something moved. Not fast. Not threatening. But undeniably there. A shape in the distance. It didn't walk. Didn't swim. It slid into frame and stopped. Its outline shimmered. Like heat through oil, constantly reforming, resisting clarity. Limbs? Maybe. But too many. A torso? Possibly. But it twisted vertically, like it didn't understand what upright meant. The feed cut again. When it returned, the shape was gone. Panic broke containment. 3 crew members demanded to surface immediately. One attempted to contact command, screaming into a dead mic. The captain gave no order. He just stared. And then Rai did something I'll never forget. She took a scalpel and slit the palm of her hand. Blood welled slowly. Thick. Too thick. She stared at it like it was the wrong color. "No coagulation," she whispered. "It's as if time's not moving in here." And just like that, the illusion cracked. People began to feel it. Subtle, but undeniable. Time dilation. Not measurable, but perceivable. A sense that our thoughts were out of sync with our bodies. Words took too long to leave the mouth. Blinks felt like full seconds. The flickering of the cameras no longer felt random. It felt paced, like a signal. I checked the logs. The feed wasn't flickering at all. It was pulsing 6 times, then pause, just like the sonar pattern. The feed had become another method of communication. Not from the ship, not from Earth, from below. Camera 3 showed the trench mouth again. But something had changed. It had opened wider, not physically, not as a cave would, but in a way that suggested permission had been granted. The walls had changed shape. The angles had receded. A corridor now extended outward, lined with ridges that looked less like construction and more like ribs. An invitation. We couldn't move. Not because of fear, but because the Davenport wouldn't let us. The controls had reset to passive. We weren't sinking. We weren't floating. We were drifting, slowly, toward that corridor. The cameras shifted again. This time, internal feeds. No one had touched the controls. Internal camera 4. Medical bay. Empty. Internal 6. Cargo hold. A single storage unit was ajar. Then the feeds began switching rapidly on their own, cycling through views, hallways, bunks, labs, engine core, faster, faster, until every screen froze. On me. Camera 9, sonar bay, my face staring into the feed, and behind me, something moving. I spun, nothing there. But when I turned back, the feed was still live, still me. Only, I wasn't moving anymore. My image sat frozen, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted. And over my shoulder, a shape was coalescing in the darkness, like a silhouette forming from fog. And then my image blinked. Before I did. That's when I screamed. The crew tore the feed down. We yanked every cable we could. Sparks flew. Systems shorted. But the image stayed. Frozen. Perfect. Until the screens all went black at once. The silence returned. Except for one thing. That hum. Lower now. Slower. But closer. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the hull. Inside us. And whatever was watching through the feed, it had learned how to look back. The worst part wasn't that the feed went dark. It was that, for a moment, we felt relieved. As if destroying the image could erase the echo it left inside our minds. As if there was a clean divide between signal and sensation. But I knew. We all knew. The thing that stared through me on that screen wasn't just being broadcasted. It was here, pressing itself into the ship like water through a cracked hull. Not entering. Just saturating. As if the Davenport was no longer steel, but sponge. The silence that followed wasn't the same as before. It was thicker now, more attentive. Silence isn't absence. It's presence, unspoken. Something was listening. And so, for a long time, we didn't speak. We moved carefully. We whispered. We pretended not to see the frost forming along seams that should have been warm, or the way condensation dripped upward, like gravity had lost interest in us. The ship's artificial rhythm, air systems, engine pulses, electrical flow, slowed unnaturally. The kind of slow you don't notice until you blink and realize the lights haven't flickered in 10 minutes. Or 20. Or maybe they never flickered at all. Maybe that was just you. When we finally tried to reach the surface again, the transmission array was still warm to the touch. Active, connected, but no signal left the ship. Every frequency we pinged returned instantly. No bounce, no delay. Not even static. Just completion. As if the signal never left the cabin. As if something out there was echoing back our attempts in perfect mimicry before they even finished. I opened the diagnostic interface. Ran a manual test. The system read, connection stable. Receiving. Only we weren't receiving anything. The log showed thousands of kilobytes incoming. But no data. Just raw bandwidth. Energy itself, flowing back in. Not from the surface, but from below. We tried the emergency beacons. Same result. 5 long-range failsafes. Redundant satellite relay. Nothing. And then, worse, the chronometer reset. Not the ship's. Mine. My personal watch. Military issue, hardened, sealed. Reset to 0000. So did Rye's, and Grant's, even the captain's pocket chronograph, a 1940s hand-wound relic passed down through 3 generations, frozen at the exact same moment. 030736. No one said it aloud, but we all knew. That was the timestamp of the flickering feed. When the face on the screen blinked before mine did, when the hum changed tone, when it stopped being sonar and became heartbeat. At 030736, the world stopped counting time for us. Grant took it the worst. Always the most grounded, the most protocol-minded. He kept rechecking systems, muttering to himself, voice cracking like a skipped record. At one point he tried to send a physical buoy to the surface, a simple black box recorder with a signal beacon. The moment it was released through the top hatch, the external feed, miraculously still intact, showed it sink. Sink. Like something above us had become heavier than the sea. That was the moment we realized we weren't underwater anymore. Not in any conventional sense. The Davenport was still intact. Lights still humming. Systems online. No breach, no damage. But when we checked our position against known depth charts, something made my skin crawl. We hadn't moved in kilometers, but the pressure levels were off. Not higher. Lower. As if the water had forgotten we were there. The weight of the ocean no longer sat on our backs. Instead, it circled us, surrounding us with patience. We were no longer in descent. We had been taken in. Rye locked herself in the medical bay for 2 hours. When she came out, her eyes looked wrong, like she was seeing everything on a 5-second delay. She told me the brain's pineal gland, under extreme isolation, can start generating dream activity during waking hours. It's called hypnagogic intrusion, she said, smiling like she was reciting a bedtime story. You start dreaming while awake. Reality leaks. I wanted to believe her. I wanted a scientific reason for what I was starting to hear in the walls, for the gentle tapping that mimicked my heartbeat when I was alone, for the feeling that someone had just finished whispering in my ear when I turned around. We attempted one final contact protocol, an ultra-low frequency burst message to command, the kind of signal used to trigger worst-case responses. The signal left the buffer. The confirmation came back before I hit send. Message received. Message understood. Only I hadn't transmitted anything yet. Grant smashed the console with a wrench. It didn't matter. The lights remained green. The confirmation screen stayed frozen, like the ship itself was satisfied with the exchange. And in that stillness, something dawned on me. It wasn't that we'd lost contact with the surface. It was that the surface had lost us. We weren't missing. We were removed. Extracted from every logical system we'd been born into, like a variable erased from an equation. And the scariest part was, none of us knew when it happened. Not precisely. Was it when we passed the shelf? When we heard the returning pulse? When the captain went quiet? Or had we always been drifting toward this? Always caught in the slow, irreversible spiral into something else? Rye suggested we prepare for pressure ascent. A full reboot. Emergency ballast release. Blow the tanks. Breach the surface. Let the world pull us back. But when she opened the chamber logs, the tanks were already empty. We hadn't been sinking. We were already at surface capacity. Only there was no surface anymore. Just depth above, depth below, depth in every direction. And in that moment, the comms came alive. Just static at first, then rhythm. The same pulse. 6 notes. Pause. But this time, with voice. Not words, not language, just intention. Something behind the sound. Something not trying to speak, but to resonate. As if it didn't need to use our language, because it had already learned our fears, our memories, our thoughts. It wasn't communicating to us. It was communicating through us, borrowing cognition like it borrowed current. And then, my own voice. Looped, recorded. I think it saw me before I saw it. Over and over. My voice, fractured by distortion, bouncing back from places I hadn't yet gone. Places I was starting to dream about. And always, at the edge of hearing, the hum. Closer, lower, smiling. It started with the drawings. Raya had always kept a sketchbook tucked into the flap of her field case, a habit from her early academic years that she never let go of, even after the funding dried up and the military grants replaced university badges. It wasn't unusual for her to sketch. Tiny aquatic worms magnified by scanning electron microscopes, nervous systems of deep-sea isopods, complex cross-sections of species no human would ever see. But what she was drawing now wasn't biological. It wasn't anatomical. It wasn't even structured. It was rhythmic, fractal, patterns that looped back into themselves like they were trying to fold two dimensions into a third, then back again. Pages and pages of these spirals, always drawn from the outside inward, as though her hand was chasing something central and invisible. No color, no notes, no Latin labels, just graphite grooves that etched so deeply they tore through the paper. She stopped sleeping. We all did, in a way. But Ray's descent was more obvious. Her speech became delayed, each word chosen as if it had to pass through a filter we couldn't see. She began pausing mid-sentence to press her ear against the wall, nodding to herself as if affirming some unspoken agreement. She claimed she could hear the sea clearing its throat. She said it in jest, but her smile was wrong. Not forced, borrowed. Like she didn't remember how smiles worked, only what they looked like. I caught her staring at the engine core one night, unmoving for hours. When I asked what she was doing, she answered without blinking. It's remembering us. At first, we thought she was cracking, but that would imply something had broken. What we saw in Rai was not fracture. It was surrender. The kind that doesn't come from pressure or fear, but resonance. As if something had matched her frequency and held the note long enough for her mind to harmonize. Grant became convinced it was a form of neuroacoustic interference. He pulled apart half the comm system, trying to isolate the looped voice recording, my voice, repeating that same phrase. He traced it to no internal source. It wasn't in any archive, wasn't being actively transmitted, yet it played from random speakers throughout the ship, sometimes just in one room, sometimes in three, never overlapping, always the exact same cadence. I think it saw me before I saw it, always in my voice, but I had no memory of saying it aloud. We stopped using names. Not deliberately, it just became harder to speak to each other as people. Names felt hollow, echoes of a language that no longer applied. We began referring to things by function, the navigator, the comms lead, the biologist, even among ourselves. I suppose I was the witness. At least, that's how I felt. As if all this was unrolling precisely so I could observe it, record it, absorb it, but never interfere. The ship grew warm. Not hot, but humid. Dense. Like the air was hanging onto us, slow to let go with each breath. Surfaces became damp with condensation even in sealed rooms. Rai claimed the walls were growing soft. She insisted she felt the texture of skin beneath the paint. We laughed it off until we too began noticing the way the walls curved subtly outward, like lungs expanding. The footage from the dive camera had been wiped, not deleted, gone. The entire drive was sterile, as though it had never existed. The system showed no record of the camera ever having been attached. And yet, the image of the face, the one we all saw, remained etched in our memories with vivid accuracy. But none of us could agree on its features. Grant remembered it as expressionless. Rai described it as smiling. I saw neither. I saw a mirror of my own face, but emptied. Not erased, just preloaded, waiting for a user. Like a mask made from memory. One day, Ray walked into the central chamber holding her own sketchbook torn in half. She laid the pages out across the floor, spirals spreading like ripples from a stone's drop. Her hair was wet. She hadn't bathed. There was no water source nearby. Her skin had the pallor of something not oxygenating properly. She spoke in whispers, no longer to us, but to the ship, or to something inside it. She asked questions, waiting for answers none of us heard. Her head would tilt, and she'd nod, lips moving silently as if receiving instruction. She claimed she knew what the creature was now. Not a thing, she said. A pattern. A memory older than evolution. It doesn't eat. It doesn't hunt. It remembers. It waits for thoughts to form, then makes them again. Better. Quieter. She seemed almost proud. Then she did something that shattered whatever fragile cohesion we had left. She opened the outer hatch. No suit. No warning. Just bare skin, trembling breath, and a kind of reverence I had never seen in a human being. We tackled her before the seal disengaged. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. Just wept. Later, in the infirmary, she whispered to me, I wasn't going outside. I was going inward. I asked her what she meant. She smiled, that wrong smile, and said, "It's already here, isn't it? It's inside you now, too." For the first time, I couldn't tell if she was right. I began hearing things no one else could. Not voices, arrangements, sonic structures behind the hum, like language compressed into frequency. I could almost decode it. Almost. Sometimes I'd wake up from a half-dream and find the symbols Ray drew scrawled on my own hands, inked in black grease from the engine room. I didn't remember doing it, but the grease didn't lie. She stopped responding to us 2 days later, still breathing, still moving, but not there. Eyes fixed on some invisible horizon none of us could see, as if she'd tuned out of our station, as if her signal had moved on. Sometimes at night I'd sit near her bunk and watch her mouth move, whispering, endlessly. Not madness. Recitation. She wasn't inventing new words. She was repeating them, practicing, as if preparing to speak with something ancient, something waiting, something listening through the bones of the sea. The sound didn't stop. That was the first clue. Even after the descent halted, even after we leveled at crush depth and the machinery quieted into a cold metallic hum, something remained. At first, it was mistaken for thermal expansion in the hull, or perhaps mechanical settling. But the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't structural fatigue. It was patterned, deliberate. It would start in the bow, a subtle, metallic tap, like knuckles brushing steel, then travel methodically along the side of the pressure hull, pausing between each panel as if testing for weakness. The first night, we told ourselves it was pressure adjusting. By the second night, no one could lie to themselves anymore. I was awake in my berth when it began again. 03:12 hours. The lights were dimmed, the ambient temperature had dropped noticeably, and the crew was in forced silence, each of us feigning rest to avoid acknowledging what was happening. The first tap came exactly when the sub's environmental systems did their hourly hum check, but this time, the rhythm responded to it. A double knock, then 3, then silence, and then the unmistakable sound of something gliding along the outer hull, dragging not claws, not tools, but mass. A presence. You don't realize how well you know the voice of your vessel until something foreign speaks in its register. This wasn't a mechanical anomaly. It was intentional. I sat up in my cot, heart pounding, trying not to blink. Even the soft red glow of the emergency strips seemed to flicker now, pulsing in sync with something I didn't understand. I felt it in my teeth, like a tuning fork pressed behind the gums. The frequency wasn't just audible. It was inside me. And then came the breach alarm. It didn't scream. It sputtered, as if the system was unsure. The breach sensors picked up pressure differential in compartment B3, the cargo bay where Ray had been relocated after her breakdown. But the readings were conflicting. A spike, a vacuum, then flatlines. Grant scrambled out of his station and headed toward the bay, muttering something about failed sensor clusters. I followed, unable to keep myself planted. I needed to see. We passed the navigation deck where Simmons sat frozen, staring at the sonar screen that no longer showed topography, just static. No one was tracking anything anymore. We were blind in all directions. When we reached the bay, the bulkhead was sealed. Ray's isolation chamber, a transparent stasis tank retrofitted from medical storage, was dark. The emergency lights glinted off condensation covering the inside of the glass, as if she'd been breathing hard against it from within. But that wasn't the disturbing part. It was the outline, a handprint, pressed from the outside. 5 fingers, but too long, too thin. The flesh that made it had to be cold. The metal was fogged from the contact, and water droplets clung to it like dew on a crypt. No one touched it. We just stood there, staring. Grant tried the console. No response. Then Simmons arrived, eyes wild, and without a word, raised his flashlight to the upper port window. That's when we saw it. Movement. Not outside the sub, but within the chamber. Inside Rye's room, floating just above her still sedated body, was a shimmer. Not quite a shape, not yet a shadow. A distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. Except it was cold. Freezing, in fact. My breath fogged instantly when I got closer. And then the sound resumed. Not the tapping. A tone. Low and steady. It came from inside the chamber. Not from Ray, not from the electronics, but from the very space around her, as if reality itself had been made to vibrate. We didn't open the door. No one said it aloud, but we all knew it had followed us in. It didn't need a hatch, it didn't need permission. Whatever it was, wherever it had been, it was part of us now, part of the vessel, and maybe worse, it had chosen Rye as its anchor. Or maybe she had called it, seen it, named it. In her drawings, still spread across the floor like ritual diagrams, we later found a spiral that matched the vibration's waveform exactly. She'd drawn it before we ever descended, before the knocking began, before the sonar first heard that echo. Later, in private, Grant told me something that chilled me more than anything else. He'd isolated the recordings from the hull sensors, compared them to previous logs from other missions. "It's not new," he said. "It was on us before we left port." He showed me overlays from our departure sonar ping, a faint signature traveling behind our vessel just outside of detection threshold. "It's always been with us," he whispered. "We just didn't have the ears to hear it until we were deep enough." That night, no one slept. Not because of fear, but because something touched the hull again. It wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to remind us that it never left. There was no formal announcement. No audible decision passed through the ship's comms, no note left on the main console. But we all knew. That night there would be no rotations, no bunks assigned, no lights dimmed. The routine was dead. Something else had taken its place, an unspoken understanding. A collective surrender to a night that none of us believed would end the same way it began. Sleep wasn't an option. The very idea of letting go, of allowing your consciousness to drift and lower its guard, felt like an invitation. To what? We didn't yet have words. But we felt it, and it felt us back. The distortion in Ray's chamber never dissipated. It didn't move or grow, it simply persisted, like a smudge on your field of vision you can't blink away. Grant stationed himself outside the medical bay with his back to the sealed door, flashlight resting across his knees like a rifle. Simmons took up watch near the sonar station, though the screens had long since surrendered to noise. His eyes never blinked. I found myself pacing the corridor between the forward hatch and the reactor room, counting my steps again and again, like the rhythm might save me from whatever madness pressed against the skin of the submarine. But madness isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with screams or alarms. It whispers in your own voice. It mimics the sound of your breathing. And that night, it wore our faces. It began with Naven, the communications officer, a man known for his quiet composure and habitual humming of old Bengali lullabies. We found him kneeling in the maintenance corridor, eyes shut, whispering names that none of us recognized. His fingers bled from clawing at the floor grates. When I crouched beside him, he turned to me and smiled with such serenity that for a moment I felt envy. "They told me your name," he said gently, as though offering a gift. "But not your real one." We sedated him, or tried to. The needle shattered against his arm. Not broke, shattered, like it struck glass beneath the skin. No one spoke of that incident afterward. Even Grant, who administered the injection, pretended it never happened. We left Naven in the galley, curled beside the emergency supply locker, humming again. This time, the melody was different. It was the sonar ping, perfectly replicated, rhythmically spaced, as if he were the one who had sent it from the beginning. Around 0200, the lights dimmed to a rust-colored pulse, not by system control, but as if the vessel itself decided that shadows were more appropriate. I passed Rye's drawings again, still scattered near the bulkhead outside the bay. One sketch I hadn't noticed before caught my eye, not because of what it showed, but what it reflected. The page was blank, save for a spiral etched so deep into the paper that it had torn through. But behind it, if angled toward the light, you could see impressions from the previous sheet. A sequence of faces, all identical, all missing eyes. And beneath them, the words, "It doesn't need to see. It remembers." We had begun to feel watched. Not the way you feel in front of a camera or under surveillance, but the way you feel when you're in the woods and all the sounds stop, like nature is holding its breath. But here, the ocean doesn't hold its breath. It speaks, and it had grown silent. The usual background groans of the deep, the pressure songs, the tectonic murmurs, they were gone, as if the sea itself had receded from around us, leaving only it behind. In the mess hall, Renner tried to open the emergency hatch. Not to escape. There's nowhere to escape to at this depth. But to let it in, he claimed. Said it was cold outside and that we were being rude. It took 3 of us to restrain him. He sobbed the whole time, not from fear, but from disappointment, like a host whose guest had been turned away. When we questioned him later, he couldn't recall any of it. Said he'd been sleeping. His hands were raw from trying to twist the valve. The emergency protocols had engaged just in time. By Oro 4:30, the walls began to breathe. I know how that sounds. I do. But I swear to you, they inhaled. Slow, drawn movements, accompanied by groans not from stress, but from flesh. The metal flexed, as if wrapped in something organic. I pressed my palm against the interior wall of the corridor near the science lab, and it was warm. Not warm like heat, warm like skin, pulsing, alive. No one admitted what they saw, but we all kept to the center of the corridors from then on. We walked as if balancing on a narrow beam, careful not to brush against the bulkheads. Simmons was the first to mutter it out loud. We're inside it now. No one corrected him, because by then, it felt true. When the emergency lights finally shut off completely around 05:30, the only illumination came from the bioluminescent emergency dye inside the auxiliary fluid tanks. It painted the ship in glows of sickly blue and green, casting our faces in tones that no longer looked human. I caught my reflection in the viewport, and I say, reflection, out of habit, not accuracy, because the face staring back wasn't quite mine. The eyes were off-center. The mouth was closed, but I felt air escaping my throat. And the pupils, they weren't round. They spiraled. The noise returned then. Not a knock, not a hum, but a chorus. Multiple tones, layered and shifting, like whale song played backward through broken speakers. It filled the entire sub, passing through walls and lungs alike. My ribs vibrated with it. Rai began to convulse in her chamber, arms twitching, mouth moving in patterns too fast for speech. We couldn't reach her. The door was sealed, and yet her words echoed in our ears. Each of us later claimed to hear different phrases, but the core was the same. You already opened the door. No one slept that night. Not because we couldn't, because we weren't allowed to. Whatever had followed us back had begun to unmake us, not with violence, but with understanding. It showed us what we were beneath the surface of our thoughts, and what it saw, smiled. It had been there from the beginning, welded into the lower deck's bulkhead like a scar never meant to be noticed. No markings, no electronic locks, no mention in the schematics. Just a patch of discolored steel, sealed decades ago with old naval welds, rough and uneven, like it had been closed in a rush. Most of us had passed it 100 times without question. It was background, dead space, the kind of detail the mind discards when survival becomes routine. But after that night, the night none of us slept, the night Ray spoke in voices not hers, and the walls began to breathe, the door was suddenly not just visible, it was open, not wide, just enough to suggest a mistake, a misalignment, a draft. But it hadn't been misaligned the day before, and the weld, the ugly, rust-bitten weld, was gone. Not melted, not torn away, simply absent. In its place, a thin seam of darkness, no more than a finger's width, but blacker than any shadow the sub could cast. It didn't reflect light. It absorbed it. Flashlights faltered when aimed at it. The beam simply ended, as if swallowed mid-air. And standing before it, we felt something behind the metal, waiting. It was Grant who touched it first. He didn't ask permission. He didn't even announce himself. He just reached out, almost gently, placing his hand against the steel, fingers spread wide like he was feeling for warmth through glass. His body stiffened immediately. His pupils contracted so suddenly they nearly vanished. Then he collapsed, foaming at the mouth. When we pulled him back, his skin was cold and his mouth was bleeding, but not from his teeth, from the inside of his cheeks, as if he'd bitten himself hard during a seizure. He came 2 minutes later, speaking French, then Mandarin, then a language none of us could identify, and finally, silence. We sedated him. He hasn't spoken since. I was the one who insisted we open it. Not because I wanted to, because I knew it already had been. Whatever had come aboard wasn't born here, nor brought. It had been freed. The hallucinations, the biological impossibilities, Rai's psychic muttering, they weren't symptoms. They were side effects. This door, this chamber, was the source. and we were already infected. Simmons argued against it. Renner refused to even be on the same level of the ship when we tried. But Rai, still catatonic, eyes tracking things none of us could see, whispered a sentence when we brought her close. "It will open when it's ready to remember." That was all. But it was enough to convince me. If memory was the key, then our presence here was no accident. We weren't explorers. We were catalysts. We cut the last sliver of metal with an emergency plasma torch, and the door gave way with no resistance. No pressure release, no hiss of long-held gas. Just a low, wet crack, like peeling open a scab. Behind it, not a chamber. Not at first, just stairs, descending. Far longer than the depth of the submarine should have allowed. 20 steps, then 30, then a landing. The walls were wrong. Smooth, but not metallic. No rivets, no pipes. The texture was soft, fibrous, like cartilage left in freezing brine. Simmons refused to go further. He stood at the threshold, clutching the torch with white knuckles, whispering prayers in a loop, unaware of his own voice. Renner followed me. I don't know why. Maybe because no one wants to be alone when walking into the impossible. Maybe because madness is easier in pairs. As we descended, the air changed. Not stale, not toxic, but tasting of something ancient. Not rot, not salt. Something like burnt bone and copper blood. My ears began to pop, then ache. Renner winced beside me. We both knew the pressure was wrong. It wasn't following normal depth behavior. It pulsed in sync with our breath. The chamber at the bottom was spherical, maybe 6 meters in diameter, lit from nowhere. Not light, but visibility, like the darkness simply stepped aside. And in the center, suspended without support, was an object, no larger than a suitcase. Obsidian in color but textured like coral, jagged, porous, wet. It vibrated faintly, a resonance you felt more in the teeth than the ears. We didn't touch it. We didn't need to. Its presence was aware, not watching, not intelligent in the human sense, just awake. Renner vomited. The sound didn't echo. The room swallowed it. I reached out, not to touch, but to measure the space between my hand and the surface. And then I heard it. Not aloud, not internally, somewhere in between. A voice. Flat, vast, eternal. Return. That was all. A word not meant for me, not addressed to me, but heard through me. As if I were a speaker left on overnight in an empty cathedral. Renner began to scream. I turned, and there was no Renner. Just the steps behind me. Empty. His voice was still there, echoing, but the body was gone. I ran. Not up the stairs. There were no stairs. Only a ramp now. Organic, soft beneath my boots, like walking on a whale's tongue. The corridor shifted. The walls now breathed in sync with my own panic. Every inch of the way back to the sub pulsed and moaned and wept condensation like sweat from diseased skin. When I emerged, Simmons was gone. Rai was sitting up, eyes closed, mouthing the word, return, over and over in perfect sync with the voice I had heard. And the door, the one we had cut through, was sealed again. No welds, no cuts, just smooth steel, like it had never been opened. I didn't tell the others what I saw. I didn't mention Renner's disappearance. I didn't explain the spherical chamber or the object that vibrated like a buried heart. I didn't need to. Because when I looked at Ray, when she finally opened her eyes, I saw Renner's reflection in her pupils, and he was screaming. Still. I spent the next hours, or what I estimated to be hours, in a place where clocks spun without ticking, trying to rationalize what I had seen. But logic had abandoned the vessel, evaporated like air in a cracked helmet. The submarine no longer felt like a man-made structure. It had become something else, a husk moving through black water, filled not with crew, but with passengers who had been rewritten. The walls were too smooth in some corridors and too fleshy in others. Lights flickered not from faulty wiring, but from an awareness that dimmed and flared as if blinking. And no one spoke of the door anymore. Not because we agreed to forget, but because speaking had become dangerous. Words had weight now. Saying something could make it real. Or worse, invited. Grant remained sedated, but his eyes never closed. He stared at the ceiling, blinking in patterns that I later realized mirrored the sonar pulses from 3 days ago. Rai wouldn't leave her quarters. She sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest, muttering phrases in ancient tongues that no translator could map. Her skin had turned pale, almost translucent at the fingertips, and beneath the paper-thin flesh I thought I could see movement. Tiny ripples, like the twitch of trapped nerves, but not hers. Something else. Something inside. I tried to focus on repairs, on data, on systems, anything to anchor myself to reality. But the screens began to betray me. Cameras showed corridors we didn't have. Empty dining rooms with tables set for no one. Observation decks where shapes moved behind the glass. Not swimming, but walking. Slowly, purposefully, toward us. At 03:17, according to the logs, an emergency klaxon triggered. Not from within the vessel, but from the external pressure doors near the moonpool chamber. A section supposedly inactive, sealed years ago. I ran. Not because of the alarm, but because I knew it wasn't mechanical. The sound was familiar. It had the same pitch, the same cadence as the sonar echo we'd picked up days earlier. The echo that wasn't ours. I reached the lower deck, alone, the others too afraid or too lost to respond. The door to the moonpool was ajar. Not open. Just enough. Inside, water was flooding upward, against gravity. It spilled along the ceiling, forming puddles in the air, droplets coalescing into shapes that tried and failed to remain solid. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in crystals. The walls groaned, not from pressure but from strain, as if holding something back. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of reflection. My flashlight cut across the pool and something moved. Not away from the light, but toward it. Toward me. Slowly. Not swimming, not gliding. Rising. It emerged with no splash, no sound, its form breaking the water's skin like a needle through silk. Humanoid only in the way a scarecrow is man-shaped. A torso too long, limbs jointed in the wrong places, neckless, faceless, and yet watching. Not with eyes, with attention. Its surface glistened with a sheen not of water but of oil, black and iridescent, refracting in impossible hues. The skin shifted in texture as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Scales, muscle, bark, bone. And beneath it, something pulsed. Not a heart. A signal. Like sonar. Like thought. Like it was calling out across dimensions in a frequency that didn't require ears, only proximity. And I was too close. I couldn't breathe. Not from fear, but because the air had thickened. It pushed back into my lungs, resisting inhalation like a living fluid. I fell to one knee, choking, eyes watering, and in that blur of pain and panic I saw something worse. Recognition. It looked at me the way one looks at a childhood home returned to after decades. Not with joy, but with the eerie nostalgia of something familiar that should have been forgotten. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't the first meeting. Only the first I could remember. Its hand reached forward, or what passed for a hand. 5 elongated digits that trailed filaments like the tendrils of a deep-sea anemone. Each one pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, faster, faster, syncing not just with my body but with my memory. I felt something burrow, gently but with finality, into my mind. Images flooded in. A spiral trench beneath the crust of the sea. Cities not built but grown. Creatures blind and ancient and praying without gods. I saw sailors swallowed by silence, submersibles turned into altars, and faces, mine, Rayes, Renners, distorted in glass coffins drifting downward forever. The creature didn't speak, but I understood. We were not explorers. We were messengers, or sacrifices, or both. And then it retreated, slowly, folding into itself, sinking not downward, but inward, vanishing as if being undone stitch by stitch. The pool was calm again. The air thinned. My lungs filled. The alarms ceased. But something stayed. In me. I didn't tell the others what I saw. I simply logged it as a pressure anomaly. A hallucination due to nitrogen narcosis. I pretended to believe it. So did they. Even Ray, who stopped whispering that night and stared at me with a calm that terrified me more than her madness ever had. Grant woke up briefly. Just long enough to say, "It knows now," before falling into another seizure. Since that moment, the submarine stopped drifting. Or rather, we lost the ability to track our own motion. Instruments spun uselessly. Sonar became a wall of static. Time folded. stretched. I began dreaming in languages I didn't know, and waking up remembering moments I'd never lived. And still, somewhere beneath the hull, I felt it. Not the creature itself, but the resonance, like a second pulse in my chest. Always just beneath the rhythm of my own. A hitch in the beat, a reminder. We hadn't survived the encounter. We had been changed by it. The thing that shouldn't exist did. And now, it existed in us. The order to surface was given in silence. Not spoken aloud, not entered into the logs. Just a look exchanged between those of us still lucid enough to remember what up meant. Rai stopped scratching symbols into her bunk and simply nodded when I found her. Renner had barricaded the bridge days ago, but when I approached, he opened the door without resistance, his face slack, like a man who'd already said goodbye to his bones. The depth gauge no longer responded to queries. The display showed numbers that spun in spirals, not increments, as if depth had become a metaphor rather than a measurement. But we tried anyway. We initiated the ascent sequence manually. Pumps groaned, ballast tanks coughed and hissed with the brittle effort of a machine that no longer believed in physics. There was no shudder, no tilt, only a soundless shift, like we were being allowed to rise. I remember bracing for the change in pressure, for the relief that usually accompanied such a move. But none came. It was as if the ocean around us had ceased to push. We were no longer resisting the weight of water. We were being lifted by something that wanted us elsewhere. Then came the first anomaly. The external sensors, what few still responded, began reporting that we were ascending. Rapidly. Hundreds of meters per minute. Then thousands. But the vessel didn't move. No vibration. No tremor. Just the numbers climbing, impossibly fast. Rai stared at the data and muttered, "We're not going up. Something is going down past us." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I tried to picture it. A drop, a fissure, a void opening beneath the seabed, swallowing water, rock, time itself. The numbers kept rising. So did the silence. At 5,000 meters, the hull began to hum. Not creak, not groan. Hum, like a tuning fork or the throat of some vast unseen creature. The sound passed through us, not over us. It reached into our bones and rearranged memories. I began recalling faces from childhood that didn't belong to me. A lighthouse on a cliff I'd never visited. A drowning that had never happened, but that I remembered gasping through. The others were experiencing it too. Renner began sobbing quietly, whispering names like a priest at a mass funeral. Rai tore off her uniform and curled into a fetal position in the corner of the lab. Her skin now mapped with thin black veins that pulsed slightly when I looked directly at them, and vanished when I blinked. And then the pressure alarms screamed. But not because we were too deep. We were ascending, supposedly. They screamed because the external pressure was increasing, not decreasing. The sea above was pressing down harder with every second. It made no sense. It was as if we were being drawn toward a second ocean layered invisibly above the real one. A weight that lived in some dimension adjacent to ours, mimicking physics just long enough to lure us upward, only to crush us in a moment of betrayal. We cut engines, tried to halt ascent. Nothing responded. Control panels flickered, not with static, but with fragments of video. Old surveillance footage from the ship's early missions. Crew members we didn't recognize. Rooms we'd never built. One frame showed the moon pool. Empty. Then not empty. A shape standing motionless at its center, backlit by nothing, face obscured by fog. The creature had followed. Or maybe it never needed to follow. Maybe we were never moving at all. We tried to reroute power to auxiliary systems. Tried to manually reboot propulsion. Every relay burned out upon contact. Wires melted into themselves. The vessel groaned, but not like steel under strain. It was a voice now. Slow. Crooked. Repeating one word, in no known language, but we all understood it. Return. Not a command. A description of our fate, of our purpose. Then the external cameras returned. For 6 seconds. Long enough to see what surrounded us. Not water, not blackness, but walls. Smooth, glassy, vertical, stretching infinitely above and below. The sub was no longer drifting through the ocean. We were inside something. A chamber, a column, a spine. The space narrowed above us. A dome closed in. And there, at its apex, floated them. Not the creature. Creatures. Plural. Silent. Not swimming. Watching. suspended in the medium like sculptures in resin. Their shapes varied, none fully symmetrical. Limbs that split and rejoined, heads that turned without moving. Some shimmered with bioluminescence, others seemed carved from stone. But all of them shared one feature, a circular cavity where their mouths should have been, pulsing open and shut in time with our heartbeat. We reached them in minutes. The depth gauge now read 000. Time fractured. I remember blinking and waking in the engine room with Ray seated calmly beside me saying, "They are not cruel, they are merely curious." I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious. My hands were bleeding. My reflection in the steel bulkhead showed hair turned white at the temples, wrinkles that hadn't been there before. Renner was gone. Simply not there anymore. No one remembered seeing him leave. Not even the system logs. The vessel stopped. Not mechanically. Not gently. Simply ceased motion, as if pinned in place by thought alone. Lights returned one by one, each casting shadows that didn't align with the fixtures. Rye smiled faintly and whispered, "Now we learn." Then the walls began to open. They peeled back like tissue, revealing layers not of wiring or circuitry but cells. Living tissue. Pores. Capillaries. This wasn't a machine anymore. It had become part of the environment. Or had always been. Maybe our entry into this space had triggered something dormant, awakened it. We weren't in a ship. We were in a body. One that had been asleep for centuries. One that now knew we were inside it. I tried to scream, but my voice came out as sonar. Not a metaphor, a literal pulse of sound. It vibrated through the chamber, was echoed by the walls, and answered by something far, far below. Then the dome closed, and everything went still. When I finally made it back to the bridge, the chair was empty. The captain's coat still hung from the hook beside the console, swaying slightly as though someone had just passed by. Though the air was still, thick with the scent of burnt circuits and a sharp, sour chemical tang that I couldn't identify. No alarms blared, no systems hummed, just silence, endless and watching. I approached the control panel, hesitant, feeling the vessel beneath me no longer as steel and rivet, but as muscle and breath. The walls pulsed imperceptibly, as though they were listening. And then, without prompt, the comm system sputtered to life, not with static but with a single message, one that had been recorded and cued. I recognized the voice before it even spoke. It was Captain Ezra Langley. Calm, slower than usual, but unmistakable. "If anyone finds this," he began, and the sound of his voice was wrong, not distorted, but detached, like it had been filtered through too many layers of something inhuman. "Then I am already gone. And so are you." There was a pause. No clicks. No ambient bridge noise. It was as if he had recorded it outside of time, outside of the vessel entirely. "I don't know what we touched," he continued. "I don't think it matters anymore. You'll be tempted to give it names. To assign it origin, motive, fear. But don't. That's how it learns you. That's how it follows." I felt the pressure shift behind me, as though the room contracted just slightly in acknowledgement of his words. I didn't turn around. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I knew whatever was behind me was no longer interested in pretending it wasn't there. Langley's voice resumed. I opened the chamber. I think it needed someone to. It doesn't break locks. It waits for them to be offered. I saw things in there that weren't built. They were grown from memories, ours, things we lost, things we buried. The chamber is not a room. It's a replica, a filter, a cradle. There was a long breath, static leaking in like blood from a reopened wound. "I saw my daughter," he said quietly. "She's been dead 12 years. But she looked the same. Same freckles. Same chipped tooth from the swing. But her eyes weren't hers. They weren't anyone's. I spoke to her. She asked why I left. But I never left. She died. She died before the ocean. But she didn't know that. Or it didn't. Whatever it was. It wanted to make me stay." I realized my hands were shaking. I hadn't touched the controls, but the system had begun flicking through internal feeds. The bunks, the lab, the flooded stern, all empty, except the camera outside the sealed chamber. There, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. Human in silhouette, unmoving, wearing the captain's coat. "I gave one last order," Langley's voice resumed, slower now, as if each word cost him something vital. "I told the sub to rise, but it wouldn't. It wanted us to learn, and then it would decide. We're part of something now. We're not crew. We're material. The recording began to distort, not in sound quality, in language. Words began overlapping, repeating, phasing into and out of different syntaxes. A voice within a voice, as if Langley's message was being echoed by something else. Not translated, mimicked. The voice said my name, my full name, a detail not in any log. I had scrubbed it when I joined the Navy, but it said it, perfectly, softly, like it was telling a bedtime story. Then another voice followed, my mother's, dead since my teens, asking why I hadn't come home. Then laughter. Children. Not laughter I recognized, but laughter meant to sound familiar. Langley's message was ending now. One last phrase, repeated 3 times. The water remembers. The water remembers. The water remembers. And then silence. I tried to pull up the crew manifest. It had been wiped. Not corrupted. Erased. No names. No faces. Just a blank index with one entry. Passenger. 1. I turned toward the chair, the one where Langley always sat. It was no longer empty. A shape now occupied it. Back to me. Shoulders too wide. Arms too long. The head tilted slightly, not in greeting but in mimicry. An angle that suggested it had seen what greeting looked like and had decided to try it on for size. I didn't speak. I didn't move. Neither did it. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one hand and pointed to the ceiling, and the vessel began to rise. Not mechanically, not with sound or effort. We ascended like ash in water, gracefully, too fast, too smooth. My ears didn't pop, my bones didn't creak. But the pressure remained, not outside, but inside, as if something in my own skull was trying to expand, to make room for something that wanted to move in. I looked around, and the bridge had changed. Not visually, but in weight. The air felt thinner, the shadows longer. I blinked once and realized I couldn't recall how long I'd been standing, or what I had done before, or what my name had been before Langley said it. When I tried to speak, my voice came out as a note, a sound, low and resonant, like a call to something waiting far above, or far below. And somewhere, through the walls of flesh and memory, I felt an answer. The captain was gone, but his order remained. And whatever had heard it had decided that it would be obeyed, not because of loyalty, but because the experiment had concluded. We had been measured, dissected, categorized, and now perhaps we were no longer needed. Or perhaps we were being sent back, but not alone, not unchanged. We broke the surface without warning. No groan of ballast tanks, no shift of gravity, no last hiss of resistance from the water. Only the abrupt stillness of arrival, like opening your eyes in a room you don't remember entering. The sea around us was flat, glass-like, endless. No birds, no breeze, no sign of the storm that had once raged above. It was as if the ocean had decided to paint over itself. The sunlight was wrong, muted, not golden but pallid, diluted. The kind of light you might expect in a photograph that's been overexposed and left too long in the rain. I didn't realize we'd surfaced until I saw the horizon. Even then, part of me doubted. It looked less like emergence than a cruel illusion crafted to keep us calm. But calm was the wrong word. The silence wasn't relief. It was rehearsal. A pause between movements. A breath before the scream. I staggered through the bridge, the weight in my limbs heavier than exhaustion. My muscles no longer answered to me as they should. It felt as though some internal puppeteer had become bored, let go of the strings, and left me to stumble forward on instinct alone. The lights had returned, dim and flickering, but consistent. The camera feeds were all active again, but showed no life. Just rooms with empty bunks, trays of untouched food, and the faint shimmer of condensation along the steel walls, except for one. The lab camera. That one had changed. On the table lay a series of items, arranged with care. My journal. A photo I had never seen before, of me as a child, in a room I didn't recognize, standing next to a man with no face, no blur, no shadow, just absence. A negative space where a face should have been, as if reality itself had refused to print the memory. Behind the table, written on the glass in some dark smeared substance, too dark for blood, too thick for ink, a message. It goes back with you. I wanted to scream, not out of fear, but recognition. I had dreamed that sentence before, many times, as a child, as a cadet. I never remembered the dream, only that I would wake with salt in my throat and the memory of a pressure I couldn't name. I found the others, what was left of them. 3 bodies, 2 in crew uniforms, 1 in civilian garb, curled together in the forward maintenance bay, their eyes open, mouths closed, skin waxen and dry. They hadn't drowned, they hadn't bled, they had simply emptied. Like fruit left too long in the sun, their husks preserved only by the vacuum of meaning that had once filled them. The 4th was missing. Dawson, the biologist, the one who'd said the eyes were watching. I checked the logs. His name was gone. Not corrupted. Replaced. Unclaimed asset. No tag. As if he had never been part of us. As if he had never been human to begin with. The spot where he'd slept now held a wet outline, shaped roughly like a man, but stretched in all the wrong directions. I activated the emergency beacon, even though I knew it would serve no purpose. The coordinates it broadcasted weren't ours. It sent out a frequency that pulsed not in regular intervals, but in patterns. Crescendos of silence, bursts of white sound, and then a tone that made my vision stutter. I turned it off before my own nose began to bleed. I knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that the message it sent wasn't a call for help. It was a summons. Or worse, a signal that the test was over, and the subject was ready for extraction. As night fell, or what passed for night in that strange half-lit world, I watched the surface change. Small ripples began to emerge from the hull, radiating outward in geometric patterns. They didn't fade. They stayed, locked in place like etchings on glass. The stars above did not align with any constellation I knew. They twinkled, yes, but the rhythm was too precise. It reminded me of breathing. I sat in the captain's chair, not out of duty, but because I could no longer stand. My body was forgetting itself. My fingers moved strangely, like they remembered a different shape, a different purpose. When I tried to write in my journal, the letters came out backwards, then upside down, then as spirals. I tore the page out, only to find the same sentence scrawled again beneath it. It goes back with you. In the final hour before dawn, I caught sight of the mainland, or what I believed to be land, a thin sliver of black against the edge of the horizon. But as I steered toward it, the sub resisted. Not mechanically, intentionally. The controls moved, but the vessel did not. Then, without any input, the engines powered down. The cabin lights dimmed again, not to darkness, but to a shade that reminded me of hospital rooms and morgues. I heard a voice behind me, and for the first time in days, I turned. It was Langley, or a version of him, not rotting, not ghostly, but differently arranged, as though someone had tried to reconstruct him from memory and had only a vague blueprint. The jaw slightly too wide, the eyes glassier than glass, the uniform pristine but slightly outdated. His mouth moved, but no words emerged. Only the sound, that sonar echo, the one that had started all of this. He held out his hand. Something rested in his palm. I reached for it, against every fiber of my will. It was my ID badge, cracked, water-damaged, covered in barnacles. I had thrown it into the trench 3 days before we surfaced. Langley, or the echo wearing him, closed my hand around it and then pointed forward, toward land, or at least, toward return. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, we were docking. They pulled me from the sub with careful hands and downcast eyes, as if handling something fragile, or cursed. I remember the click of boots on metal, the sting of the light overhead, not warm sunlight, but the bleached fluorescence of a hangar hidden in the folds of some nameless coastal base. No questions were asked, not at first. I was sedated before my feet touched solid ground. When I awoke, it was not in a hospital, not in a barracks, but in a cold room with padded walls and no clock. The ceiling vent whispered. That same frequency, a soft modulation I recognized instantly. It was the echo. Muffled. Trapped behind aluminum and policy. I tried to scream, but the air hung too thick. Instead, I whispered his name. Langley. Just once. As if it would verify that it had all been real. A knock came, followed by the buzz of an automatic lock. A man entered with two others behind him. He had no insignia, no clipboard, no name badge. Just a crisp suit and eyes that had never once blinked at anything truly unknown. He sat down across from me and didn't speak for a full minute. Then he slid a manila envelope across the table. My name was printed on the tab, not stamped, not typed, but written in my own handwriting. "Do you recall the moment you breached classified depth parameters?" he asked. But it wasn't a question. It was an invocation. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. He tapped the envelope. "Everything that happened below 9,000 meters is to be unremembered." I blinked. "You mean classified?" I finally asked, my voice like broken glass. "No," he said. "I mean unremembered." He stood and gestured toward the door. "You'll be given a new file, new duty. You'll be examined by men who don't know what you've seen and who think their instruments still define the ocean. You'll nod. You'll pass. You'll live." I stared at the envelope. "And them?" I asked. "The others?" He hesitated for a moment too long. "What others?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to shout their names, to list ranks and cabin numbers, to remind him that a sub doesn't return without a crew. But when I tried to summon their faces, all I saw were shapes, blurred outlines, a knot of silhouettes, drifting away behind glass. "We have decided you were alone," he said flatly. "And in time, you will too." The envelope was still on the table. I reached for it. Inside were a few documents. One was my own discharge form, dated 3 months prior to the mission. Another was a psych evaluation citing prolonged hallucinatory episodes during a fictitious maritime training exercise. The final item was a photo, the same one I had seen on the lab table. Me as a child, that faceless man beside me. But this time, someone had circled the background. There was a window. Outside it, the sea. Only now, I noticed the shadow. A curl, a fin, a curve too large and perfect to be a whale. There were numbers scribbled beneath the image. Not coordinates. A frequency. I felt it rather than read it. A low hum began to pulse behind my eyes. They took the photo back before I could speak. "Consider this the end," he said. "If you speak, the ocean opens again. You wouldn't want that." I laughed. It was dry and brittle. "You think I brought it here?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just placed a black card in front of me. Blank on both sides. "When you hear it again," he said, "call this number." I looked at the card. "There's no number." He smiled thinly. "Exactly." I was discharged the next morning. No ceremony. No papers. I was given clothes that didn't fit, a cab voucher, and a memory that no longer belonged to any record. I wasn't listed in the logs. The sub had no name. It had, apparently, never departed. And yet my hands were still pruned from salt water. My boots still held sand in their soles. And the badge Langley had given me, cracked, barnacled, still weighed in my pocket like an anchor. I went home, if you could call it that. My apartment had been leased to someone else. My bank accounts were frozen for inactivity. My parents, both long dead, received my pension. I was a ghost wearing someone else's skin, navigating a city that remembered me only as an echo. I got work on a civilian vessel, charting shallow coasts, tourists, and amateur divers. They joked about the deep, laughed about monsters. Sometimes I laughed with them. Sometimes I stared too long at the sonar, waiting. One evening, I passed by a military memorial on the waterfront. Names etched in bronze. I scanned for my crew, for Langley, for Dawson, for anyone. Nothing. Only a blank space where I was sure a plaque had once been. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. Not from the water. From beneath the ground. A soft, rhythmic thrum. A pulse that traveled through my heels and up my spine. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was familiar. Patient. The kind of sound that waits for the right ear to come close again. I checked my coat pocket. The card was there. Still blank. Still warm. Still humming. I didn't call. I walked home in silence. And the ocean followed. The sound has never left me. It lingers in the stillness between streetlights and breath, hidden in the hush of empty stairwells and the subtle creaks of old plumbing. In the beginning, I mistook it for tinnitus, some residual damage from the pressure, the strain, the depth. Doctors told me it was stress, that the mind, when fractured, will invent patterns. But it's not in my ears. It's in the walls, in the wind that slides beneath doors, in the pause before a train enters the tunnel. I've moved 6 times since that day, inland, each time farther from the coast. Colorado, then Kansas, then the edge of South Dakota. But water finds you, in snowmelt, in frozen pipes, in condensation crawling along basement corners. It seeps, and with it comes the rhythm, the call, the low, deliberate echo that doesn't ask, only waits. I don't sleep much now, not because of fear, not anymore, but because the silence feels dishonest. The real world is too quiet, too clean. It doesn't carry weight like the deep does. When I close my eyes, I'm back in the sub, breathing recycled air, the walls groaning in protest as something ancient runs its fingers along the hull. I see Langley at the console, staring too long into nothing, and Dawson's wide eyes just before the lights died. I hear the metal flex around us, a slow exhale of pressure, and the laugh. Not human, not mechanical, but some third thing in between. In the daylight, I pretend to function. I stock shelves at a hardware store. I drink coffee that tastes like it's trying too hard. I tell myself that everything I saw was a hallucination. But then the radio fizzles. The lights flicker. The automatic sprinkler system goes off without warning, spraying not water but salt. And I feel it again, behind me, beneath me, below everything. Watching. They said we were alone down there. They buried the data, sealed the logs, rewrote the manifests. But I wasn't the only one who made it back. I know this now. I've seen them. The others. Not face to face, not clearly, but in the edges of crowds, in the eyes of strangers who glance too long at the ocean. There's a look we share, a stiffness in posture, a flinch at certain frequencies. I once followed a man 2 blocks because he hummed the note. That same cursed tone we heard in the belly of the sea, the one that cracked open our instruments and bent the screens. He turned and looked at me, not surprised, just tired, as if to say, "You hear it too." We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We both walked away, knowing we were still tethered by something that could never be named. Sometimes I receive mail with no return address. Thick paper, black ink, lines of numbers, symbols that don't correspond to anything I can identify. Sometimes a single word. Listen. Once, I found a cassette player on my doorstep with no tape inside, only a note that read, "It doesn't need one." I pressed play anyway. Nothing came out. But that night, the hum got louder, like something had been unmuted. I tried to trace the signal again, triangulate the sound as we did on the sub. But every time I narrow in, it shifts. Like it knows. Like it's playing with me. Like I was never the observer, only the observed. There was one evening, just last month, when the sound stopped. I didn't notice it at first. Only after hours of unnerving stillness did I realize. It was gone. No thrum beneath the floor. No vibration in the faucet. No pressure in my chest. For the first time in years, I wept. I thought maybe it was over. Maybe I had finally outlived its memory. But then, as I lay in bed, I felt something under the mattress. Cold. Damp. Moving. Not crawling. Sliding. A weightless glide like something displaced water. I didn't dare check. I just lay there as the temperature dropped, as the walls began to swell with moisture, as the silence itself began to breathe. When morning came, the floor was soaked. My shoes were floating by the closet. There were no leaks. The landlord blamed the weather, but the sky had been clear. I dried everything and told myself it was a freak event. But later that day, I found the black card again. The one they gave me. Still blank. But now the corners were curling like they'd been underwater. And on the back, a new symbol. One I'd seen carved into the sub's viewing dome when the fog cleared. A spiral with a slash through it. A mouth held shut. I no longer try to explain it. Not to myself. Not to anyone. The sea is not just water. It is memory. It is hunger. It is the perfect silence beneath all noise. And once it knows you, it never forgets. I hear it now as I write this. That low call, modulated like a sonar ping, slowed to a heartbeat. Sometimes I wonder if it really is the ocean, or if the sound is inside me now, part of my blood, my marrow, resonating with something older than sound. I've considered going back, finding a boat, heading to those forbidden coordinates. But I know better. It doesn't want me to return. It wants me to carry it, to spread it, to be its echo. And I am. Even here. Even now. You're listening too, aren't you? Don't lie. You hear it. Beneath everything. Waiting.